Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett. And just yesterday, I finished reading chapter 15, which was the last chapter in my first book, Seven Sisters, The Voyage. And so now that I've done that, I'm going to start on my second book, which is called Seven Sisters, Overland Trek. Now, let me explain a little bit about this. First of all, the story of the Seven Sisters takes place on a journey that has three legs. The first leg is from London docks to the New York docks. So they came across the ocean for 44 days, and that's the story of the first book. The second leg is from New York City by steamboat and trains to go across the United States till they get to a place called Florence, Nebraska. Now, that's the second leg. And at Florence, Nebraska, that's the jumping off point for the pioneers to cross the plains. So the third leg of the journey is from Florence, Nebraska to the Rocky Mountains to the Salt Lake Valley. So in my second book, there are actually two legs. Okay, the reason I didn't make three books was I thought I couldn't afford it, so I put them both into this book. And halfway through, where it starts with the third book, it has a break, and you know that you're in the new book, I guess you would say. But so I'm going to start reading to you from the second leg of the journey, Seven Sisters Overland, because they have to go overland from New York to Nebraska. Now, when I was writing this book, I decided to write a little bit of a prelude at the beginning to let people know, to bring them up to speed, so that if they didn't read the first book, they could actually know what was going on, I hope, by reading this prelude. And then it would help them understand the book, what happened beforehand. Okay, so at the very, very beginning of the book, there is an author's note, and this is what it says. Beginning in 1840, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints missionary efforts in Europe were extraordinarily successful, and with the doctrine of gathering to Zion, which had been preached by its prophet and president Joseph Smith, all the converts were taught that immigration would directly follow faith, repentance, baptism, the laying on of hands, and tithing as soon as the way consistently opened. The gathering had two main purposes. First, Zion needed to be built up so the church could have a strong, permanent base in Utah and become economically self-sufficient. And secondly, the pure in heart needed a place of refuge from the religious persecution they had been experiencing and from the sins of the world. After the Amazon immigration ship arrived in New York City on July 19, 1863, its Mormon company of 800 saints was reduced by close to 40 families. These families stayed in the area to finish earning their fares to the west. The rest of the Amazon saints were divided into two riverboats, the St. John and the Mary Powell. The two groups of saints were then independent of each other as they began their overland journey to the Mormon outfitting camp in Florence, Nebraska territory. Because the former president of the Amazon Company, William Bramall, and his two counselors had been placed in charge of the Mary Powell saints, President John Harvey Tippett was newly called to be in charge of the St. John saints, with Presidents John Pinkerton and Elijah Larkin as his counselors. So now we're reducing the group from 800 down to about 250 on one steamboat and about 250 on the other steamboat. I said that. It was a little disconcerting to have the Amazon company divided in half for the next part of the journey, but the two companies planned to reunite when they arrived in Florence. If not before then, when they crossed paths en route to their destination. The church used the Hudson River Day Line with its fleet of modern riverboats because it was one of the most prominent and dependable companies to carry tourists and passengers up the Hudson River to Albany, to connect with trains there and transport them west through a system of railroads, and then on waterways to the edge of the American frontier on the Missouri River. This route was chosen by church leaders so the saints could avoid the battlefields of the American Civil War, which had been raging in the States since 1861. All right, now is the little background information called the prelude. Eleanor Wise looked out over the shimmering Hudson River as she and her sisters stood on the deck of the St. John steamer. Earlier that morning, they had been released from their inspection and registration at Castle Garden Immigration Depot and were anxious to be on their way to Zion. These girls weren't actually Eleanor's sisters as such, but they were her sisters in the gospel. She recalled how she had been placed with them on the Amazon in London, where their journey began on June 4th, 1863. They were all unmarried and from different parts of England, traveling to America without the benefit of parents or guardians. Consequently, the leaders of the company put them together as a family to look out for each other on the voyage. There were 7 of them in number, and they had become known to the saints on board as the 7 Sisters. It was just easier for everyone to refer to them collectively rather than try to remember their individual names. Eleanor had grown to love each of her sisters very much. Caroline Cleverly had been raised with privilege and indicated that she had never known any kind of work before her arrival on the Amazon. Now she seemed eager to learn everything she could to prepare herself to become a good pioneer. She expressed that she was finding the work to be a fully satisfying endeavor. She was poised and refined, and her elegant clothes were made of unusually expensive and lovely cloth, which Eleanor had never seen the likes of before. She had wide-set blue eyes and flaxen hair that framed her fresh-looking face. Caroline wouldn't have any trouble finding a suitable husband, Eleanor thought, but she had been put off by men ever since Peter, her fiancé, wouldn't embrace the gospel and had broken off their engagement when she wanted to join the church and immigrate to America. Eleanor herself had come on board without any luggage because she had run away from home to immigrate with the saints to Zion. There was only one way to leave without raising the suspicion of her cruel, vindictive mother, and that was to go to work as usual and then catch a train to Liverpool to join the immigrating saints there. Now she got to share Caroline's lovely clothes. It was like playing dress-up every time she put on one of Caroline's frocks. 6-foot-tall Lavinia Triplet had grown a great deal on the voyage, not in height, but in confidence and poise. Eleanor recalled how self-conscious and unsure she had been at the beginning of the voyage. She was quite a bit older than the rest of the sisters at 35 years of age, and was rather set in her ways. When Eleanor first met Lavinia, her hair was in a severe bun, and she wore dark clothing, which made her look like a widow in mourning. Her face was pinched and serious. Eleanor was glad she and her sisters had helped Lavinia gain new confidence by giving her a softer hairstyle, lending her some of their clothes, and teaching her how to be sociable with men. This confidence brought new radiance to her countenance and new attention from the choir director, George Careless, who talked her into joining the ship's choir after he heard her splendid voice. Now her singing was an inspirational force whenever the saints sang together. The ocean voyage had been a lark for 10-year-old twins, Phoebe and Fanny Watts, whose infectious enthusiasm kept the children on the Amazon entertained with games and plenty of mischief. The twins' names were easy to remember because of their musical ring, but Eleanor was confused sometimes about which name went with which twin. They both wore their hair in braids. Phoebe crisscrossed hers in the back and pinned them up behind her ears, and Fanny let her braids fall down to her, Fanny. But sometimes when they were playing hard, Phoebe's braids fell down to her fanny too. And then Eleanor had to look closely for a small chickenpox scar on Phoebe's right cheek to tell them apart. More often than not, they had mischievous looks on their faces, especially when they raised their eyebrows, pursed their lips, and tried to look innocent. The twins were shepherded by their older sister, Susanna, who was just shy of 19 years of age. She was taking them to meet their mother and older brother, who had already immigrated to Utah the year before. Susanna had her hands full with the twins. She wasn't much older than they were, really, and she was a little immature herself, or, as Eleanor reasoned, inexperienced at handling double trouble. Susanna had to rely on her new sisters to act as the twins' other mothers. Eleanor couldn't be in a bad mood when Susanna was around because she just glowed when she smiled, and her eyes danced happily. These traits had captured the heart of Marcus Fielding, a returning missionary from Wales. Eleanor's thoughts then turned to Lizzie Cornell, who was once counted as one of the 7 sisters. She was such a fun and feisty girl on their voyage, but had unwisely left the safety of the Saints in New York City to stay with one of the Amazon sailors named Alfie. They had fallen in love and planned to sail down around the Horn of South America and up to San Francisco to work in the gold fields there. She promised her sisters faithfully that she and Alfie would come to Salt Lake City after they struck it rich. Eleanor and her sisters continually prayed for Lizzie's happiness, but they weren't worried. They knew she was a survivor. Alinda May Poulsen, Lizzie's replacement, was a young Danish mother-to-be from the Synoger immigration ship that arrived the same day as the Amazon. Eleanor wondered how this new sister would fit in with their group. She was an unknown entity and only spoke a few words of English. All Eleanor knew about her was that her young husband had succumbed to an epidemic of measles, which mercilessly swept through the Synoger on its voyage across the ocean. Her eyes and nose were continually red from crying, and her face was blotchy, but she seemed very sweet and humble. Eleanor knew she would have to watch Alinda May closely because she was only a few weeks away from delivering her firstborn. Eleanor thought of her own position in the 7 sisters. She got the impression her sisters thought of her as the mother of the group, mainly because she was always making sure each sister was healthy and happy. Many times they turned to her for advice and leadership, so she just accepted this role. She learned a great deal about nursing on the Amazon when she was the head of the health committee, but the most important lesson she learned was about the beauty of the atonement and the miracle of forgiveness through her experience of nursing Amazon crewman Titus Holt back to health. Thinking of Titus caused her hazel eyes to well up. She turned her back and secretly dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief while she recovered her composure. She didn't want to have to explain her tears to her sisters. Then a wave of happy anticipation spread over her. She was delighted that the 7 sisters were once again restored in numbers after Lizzie's unexpected departure. She looked forward to the second leg of their journey from New York to Nebraska Territory. The sisters had thought of themselves as a family during the 44-day voyage on the Amazon, and just the night before, they had vowed to stay together all the way to Utah, no matter what their challenges might be. Eleanor planned to do her part to make sure this happened. Chapter 1, Overland, July 20th, 1863. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the St. John," boomed the first mate into a megaphone, interrupting Eleanor's thoughts. "We will be traveling up to Albany today, with stops at Cornwall, Poughkeepsie, Kingston, and a few private docks along the way. May we gently remind you that all passengers must conduct themselves properly or run the risk of being put ashore. You will be under the command of Captain Daniel Deacon Drew and river pilot Ambrose Meekum." The 2 men gave a sharp salute to the passengers assembled on each deck, who in turn pattered appropriate applause. The pilot then went inside the enclosed wheelhouse at the front of the steamer, and the captain stood by the huge bell on the bridge. The crew stood at attention below, waiting for the signal to cast off the lines. 3 loud whistle blasts declared the steamer was ready. The captain gave orders, and the first mate repeated them to the crew, who in turn performed them with efficient precision. They were nothing like the irreverent crew on the Amazon, who were roughly hewn but able to get the job done as they parroted commands, many times adding their own crude remarks at the end. The captain pulled the bell rope twice, and a faint jingling was heard far below in the engine room. Then a rumbling sound began, and everyone felt the ship tremble as the 40-foot side wheel started to rotate backward and move the ship away from the dock. After moving a good 50 feet, the engines were cut, and the steamer drifted with the current. 30 seconds later, the bell rang in a certain pattern, and one of the side wheels churned slowly in a forward direction as the other one continued backward, causing the ship to turn 90 degrees in place and point her nose up the river. Another signal caused the 2 side wheels to turn in the same direction. Soon there was a mass of white foaming splendor trailing behind the steamer. A high whistle sound could be heard from the gauge cocks below as the steam built it to its proper level. The steamer moved into the right side of the wide Hudson River Channel and settled into its routine of chugging along at the proudly advertised speed of 8 knots per hour with hardly a vibration. The St. John was a fairly new ship with a high dome deck and luxurious stateroom galleries. Its selling point was a grand staircase for the first-class passengers to ascend and descend with as much pomp and elitism as they could emote. Even though the Saints were stationed on the boiler deck, they could glimpse part of the first-class deck and enjoyed living vicariously through the well-dressed, well-mannered aristocrats there. Couples strolled around the deck with their arms linked and their heads nuzzled together. They whispered into each other's ears and laughed and embraced each other, oblivious to the gawking audience from afar. The Saints were a bit shocked at the impropriety being shown in the public by their new countrymen. Everything seemed more open in America. It wasn't as prim and proper as it was in England under Queen Victoria's puritanical rule. Those who weren't strolling the deck were sitting at tables, while waiters served them coffee in demitasse cups, along with cucumber sandwiches on what appeared to be white bread. Very few of the Saints had ever seen such a thing, let alone tasted it. It wasn't very common in the English countryside. Knowing Caroline's family was wealthy, Lavinia couldn't resist. "Have you ever tasted white bread, Caroline?" Caroline closed her eyes and thought, "I miss it so much." "Really?" questioned the twins together. "No," said Caroline, laughing good-naturedly. "It's rather bland. I like chewing something with substance." It was blissful steaming up the Hudson River. Both sides had voluminous trees whose branches reached out over the water as though they were pining for long-lost companions on the other side. The immense flocks of geese and ducks floated along the shorelines and bobbed to find worms or insects for their early morning breakfast. The air was pure and invigorating, mainly because the heat of the sun hadn't reached its full intensity yet. The sensation of moving on the water, along with the beautiful scenery, was intoxicating to the 7 sisters, who were now sitting down on the crowded deck. Alinda May's sadness drifted to the background as she became fascinated by the sights and sounds of the river. "Hayne?" she questioned as she pointed to a rooster strutting along the shore, alternately flapping his wings and pecking at the gravel near the water. "Rooster," Caroline pronounced clearly. "Rooster," Alinda May repeated. "Hayne is rooster." Just then the rooster threw his head upward and crowed loudly. "Remarkable," said Fanny. "What's remarkable?" asked Alinda May. "Well," said Fanny, "if you don't know what to say, just say remarkable." "Remarkable," Alinda May said, this time emphasizing the mark with a higher pitch. Everyone laughed at her comical pronunciation. "American roosters, just like Danish roosters," she stated. "Yes, roosters speak the same language all over the world," said Caroline, making a circular motion with her hands to indicate the world. "Rooster language," Alinda May said, smiling. She wrote the word Hayne in her journal, and then rooster. She had almost 30 words so far. Jane Clotworthy, who was sitting with her husband Hugh a few feet away from the sisters, was enjoying the lesson. She was usually stationed near where Eleanor was sitting. Eleanor encouraged it. She had been acting as Jane's nurse and emotional support ever since the Saints left Castle Garden. Her overall health had improved considerably from her lowest point on the Amazon when she suffered the deaths of her mother and only son, Brigham, within 2 short weeks of each other. Time had lessened the sting a little. She had gone from being unkempt, staring into space, and weeping continually, to focusing more on the people and environment around her, which seemed to derail her gloom. She reached over and patted Alinda May's arm. My mormor, she said, touching her heart, is from Denmark. Alinda May's face brightened. Mormor? Then she thumbed through her book. Ah, yes, grandmother. She taught me lullaby, said Jane. Alinda May looked puzzled. She repeated lullaby and rocked an imaginary baby in her arms as she sang a little trill. La 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 la. Oh, yes, Vagusiviv. Sing, please. I guess that means lullaby. Don't know how to say that. Anyway, Vagusiviv. Jane resisted for a few seconds, then forgetting herself, she sang in Danish. Eleanor watched her exchange with delight. She nudged Lavinia and whispered, This is the first time Jane has interacted with anyone except me or her husband since her son's death. Isn't it wonderful, Lavinia said. The St. John was strictly a passenger steamer, no freight on board, but the Saints saw plenty of scows and barges laden with commerce, moving up and down the river and entering from the side channels. Everyone was enthralled watching the barges, stacked with coal, bricks, crushed stone, lumber, livestock, grain, or bundled hay, being shoved or pulled along by determined little towboats. I heard President Tippett say that some of the barges carry ice that has been harvested from the river's surface in the winter, said Eleanor, because of great demand in New York City. Why does New York City want ice, said Lavinia, recalling her experience of slipping on the icy deck of the Amazon and being knocked unconscious for a time. Brr, I just can't imagine it. They have something called an ice box where they put a block of ice to keep meat cold, said Marcus, approaching the group. That is quite an idea, said Susanna, smiling up at Marcus as he found a space to sit beside her. She was happy to have Marcus join their conversation. He seemed to know a lot of things and could answer almost all of her questions. He had a way of explaining things that kept her rapt attention, and his light blue eyes behind his wire-framed spectacles weren't too difficult to look at either. She realized her interest in him hadn't waned one bit since leaving the Amazon. Everyone enjoyed the conversation as they traveled up the river, but after a while, Fanny got disinterested and started to dig through Susanna's bag. What are you looking for, Fanny? I'm feeling hungry. Me too, said Phoebe. This is the hungriest I've been since we got off the Amazon. I was hoping to find something to eat in here, said Fanny. This brought the subject of food to everyone's mind, and they started to think about what they might eat. Marcus could see Susanna had her hands full with the twins, so he excused himself to join the other missionaries who were situated at the far end of the boat. A few rations the sisters brought with them from the Amazon were dwindling rapidly, but they shared what they had with each other and relished every bite. Travelers often felt nigh hungry when they traveled across America. The leaders of the church in Utah felt a tremendous responsibility to feed the hundreds of immigrants they helped bring to Zion each immigration season. It was a long, difficult journey to Utah, which only brave and faithful saints attempted. They had to first endure the 6-week journey across the ocean, where they ate from the ship's rations. Then once in America, they were on their own to purchase food when they stopped at towns along their route. Food became an uncertainty instead of a constant. After eating, the sisters became a little drowsy until a loud whistle blast from the steam pipes jolted them back to consciousness. The voice of the first mate on the megaphone explained, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are sorry if that loud blast startled you just now. We have a tradition here on the Hudson River that every steamer rounding the Port Ewan bend gives the Port Ewan salute." The saints chuckled at this phenomenon. "Those of you who travel this river frequently know we pay homage to a statue of Madonna cradling a tugboat in her arms, Our Lady of the Hudson, which is a monument built here to recognize local boatmen." This brought smiles from the passengers and a nice round of applause, which also helped the sisters wake up from their dozing. Each mile the St. John traveled up the river brought beautiful new scenes of crops and fields, grazing cows, wild grapes, hollyhocks, and mansions set back in the trees, which evoked oohs and ahs from the sisters. "How would you like to live there?" asked Susanna, pointing at a 3-story mansion with 6 huge white pillars in front. Just then a series of bells sounded, and the steamer headed for an elaborate dock at the foot of the mansion's property. The steamer stopped to let a father, mother, and 3 daughters off. The oldest daughter looked about the same age as the twins, with the younger 2 sisters stepping down in height. They wore starched white dresses with square collars and blue trim. Their white high-top shoes had 8 or 10 buttons running up each side. They also had round straw hats with the brims curved upward and a blue ribbon encircling them and trailing down their back. The whole family looked as though they had just stepped out of a lovely New England painting. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" asked Lavinia. Caroline didn't want to flaunt her rich upbringing to her sisters. The house where she lived in Lancashire was every bit as big as this mansion, and her mother always dressed her in the latest fashions when she was younger. But now she wanted to fit in with her sisters, so she just marveled with the rest and said nothing. As the St. John pulled away from the private dock, everyone watched the idyllic family walk up the rose-lined path until they were out of sight. "Oh, how I miss my little sisters," said Eleanor, tearing up. Lavinia immediately started to sympathize until Caroline abruptly interrupted them. "Eleanor, tell us about Aunt Lucy." Eleanor's mind changed directions as she dried her tears and cleared her throat. "Well," she said, "Lucy was Father's baby sister. He was almost 12 years older than she was, but she was only 6 years older than I was, so she was more like an older sister to me than an aunt." The sisters smiled as Eleanor began to get lost in her memories. Her countenance softened, and she smiled freely while they talked. "Lucy was so pretty with her long auburn hair and green eyes. I adored her," said Eleanor. "We played together when we were younger, but when she got to be a young lady, John Whittier took notice of her beauty and began courting her. That was about when I was old enough to be in charge of my 3 younger sisters, Charlotte, Bonnie, and Mary Kate. After Lucy's marriage to John, they moved away for a few years, but eventually came back and settled in the cottage across the meadow from our home. She started to visit me more, but I think my mother was jealous of how much time I spent with her. She didn't like her distracting me and was mostly out of sorts when she came to visit. She always had chores for me to do, but sometimes she was agreeable when we offered to take the little girls to the orchard and let them play in the tall grass and flowers so she could go to the market. We played princesses and made daisy chains to put in their blonde curly hair, but the most fun we had was helping them ride the lambs that were grazing in the next pasture. Those little girls fell off the lambs more than they stayed on. We laughed ourselves silly. Aunt Lucy introduced me to the gospel 2 years ago, and ever since then, I've been sneaking a few pence out of my work money I turned over to my mother so I could save enough to immigrate. And when Aunt Lucy and Uncle John sent me the remaining amount I needed, I finally got the courage to leave. Now they are in Florence waiting for me. The letter I got from them in New York told me that if the company wasn't there by August 1st, they would be asked to leave their temporary cabin and join another company on its journey to Utah. The priesthood leaders have to make room daily for arriving immigrants. Eleanor's tears started falling again. What if we don't get there in time? You'll make it, Eleanor, said Lavinia. We're all praying for you. This made Eleanor feel a little better, but she's still worried there might be delays in the company's traveling plans. Anything could happen. And that's the end of chapter 1. Over and out.